when she was in my comp theory class a year ago, fall 2010, she was working. We do a lot with language and culture, and because the class is a required class for future English teachers, and the horror stories of what English teachers can do in the classroom are untold. Actually, they're actually told a lot to composition teachers when they get to college. But so we include a lot of reading about the relationship of writing and language and culture, and some of the books are over there, so we read excerpts from some of those books. But it was so much fun to see Elena's face just come alive, and actually Jenna and Elena lived together. So not only did they talk in class, they would go home and discuss it all over again. And so all of their responses to the reading were definitely graduate level work, because they were discussing it with themselves and writing about it, and it just grew. And so Elena decided to pursue some of the ideas that she did some research on for her final project. And if anyone knows me, there's a lot of people that don't know me here, but I am not one to say, whoa, back, you're making too many connections here. I really am, I'm an over-connector myself. But about midway through the fall, Elena was taking, what was the class you were taking? The sustainability,
environmental ethics.
Environmental ethics, and she was just so, and Elena really does, Jenna, am I right? She connects everything to everything, doesn't she? Which is her beauty, and she just has an insatiable curiosity about everything. But when she started going down that sustainability trail, I said, no, you know, you're going to have to clean this all up in the end. Are you sure you want to go down that trail? And there was no talking her out of it. And of course she went down that trail, and you know, you'll see what she discovered, but really exciting stuff, because she really was willing to take risks, and she was willing to do lots of exploration before she started pulling it all together. I think she found incredibly interesting and really important things that I hope she'll continue to pursue as she goes on to graduate school next year at Middlebury. But the other thing I love about Elena, and I know many of her friends are here, and you know this too, Elena is an incredible scholar, but she's always connecting her scholarship to her real life service. And so her ability to connect her passion for human rights and her scholarship, especially in the field of English language, where I think sometimes we really struggle with that. I just have loved watching her take off, and know that she'll continue to do amazing things as she goes to graduate school. Middlebury next year, and who knows where after that. But I hope you'll enjoy her presentation. Thanks for your work on that.
I don't think I have anything to add to that introduction, so very kindly given by Jean, who is also, I should add, an amazing person. All of you should try and get a chance to know her as well. So, without further ado, I think I will begin my presentation and begin with inviting you to hear a short story, a myth, actually, as it were. Some of you will have heard this before if you attended the Humanities Symposium this February, so you can probably sit back if you have, but here's the bulleted version. So, pictured above is Philomela, who's a princess of Athens, and she desires, in this story, to visit her sister, Cockney, in the Kingdom of Greece. However, to do so, she has to travel with her sister's husband, who, unfortunately, is not the most faithful or well-intentioned person. On the voyage, he lusts after Philomela to the extent which, at the border of Greece, he takes her to a cabin deep within the woods, and there brutally rapes her. However, Philomela is not one to be silenced, and in defiance of her captor, she cries out against the abuse that she suffered. And unfortunately, for this defiance, Tereus responds by cutting out her tongue. So there she remains trapped, voiceless, and brutalized, until about a year later, she discovers a loom on which she begins to weave her story. Greek mythology is rife with tales of physical violence and rape. However, the story of Philomela is one that stands apart for its emphasis not only on the horror of physical rape, but also on the perversion of language that attends it. In raping Philomela, Tereus acts on his own selfish desire and imposes that desire on those over whom he rules. His is a singular and exclusive ideology. Consequently, in Tereus's warped perception, language exists only to fulfill his wants and desires, and therefore becomes a commodity that he feels he can remove if the story it tells runs counter to his will. However, his attempt to alienate language from its source not only inhibits the flourishing of those over whom he rules, but also dictates his own degeneration, a degeneration that thousands of years, miles, and societal shifts later, we now confront in the English-speaking world. So, now it's time for a little economics lesson with our favorite finger puppet, Karl Marx. In Das Kapital, Marx says that a commodity is a thing that by its properties satisfies human wants of some sort or another. And so as the English language fills the wants and needs of dominant economies by becoming essential to trade and therefore active among common people, English is, in many ways, a commodity of the modern market. However, there's a danger in commodifying the English language, because while English is a commodity of the market, its market value does not define its identity. Marx identifies the commodity not only as an object filling a want or a need, but also as necessarily linked to the ideologies and perspectives of its creator or creators. In Marx's time, this idea of commodity fetishism would have been evident in, as Schweitzer showed us 3 weeks ago, Victorian perceptions of beauty and morality as embodied by the style of women's fashion. So bringing that back to language, if what is vital for a society's understanding and use of a commodity is an acknowledgement of the relationship between the commodity and the ideologies it expresses, then what's degenerative is the alienation of a commodity from its originator. And to apply this to language only when a society's native tongue is empowered will that society thrive. And this brings us to our thesis. So, which is prompted by a question. What's wrong with the maintenance of a singular dominant language? And how, if linguistic and economic prevalence are interconnected, can we overcome this type of hegemony of monolingualism? And in the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to seek to answer these questions through an exploration of the ways in which a validation of the world's many languages benefits the interconnected fields of linguistic science, biodiversity, cultural heritage, personal identity, and human rights. So, on the most basic level, the multiplicity of language benefits the linguistic sciences. We see this in the multiple forms, like syntax, grammar, and the phonetics that languages fuel the sciences with, in addition to the way in which language acts as a storehouse of cultural, ecological, and personal information, and finally, through the ways in which we learn about human cognition or psychology through language. However, while multilingualism revitalizes the linguistic sciences, to appreciate it for the sake of linguistic science seems a bit redundant. And so we're going to move away from the sciences and go further into language's position as it is molded by and purveyor of the human relationship to our world, beginning with the ecological. And you can look at that quote if you want while I discuss this slide. There exists not only a connection between thought, language, and action, but also between all three and the natural world in which the person thinking, articulating, and doing is situated, and the ideologies that ground one's perception of the natural world and his or her responsibility to it manifest themselves in language. And in one respect, we see this through the difference between holistic language and exploitative language. A good example of holistic would be in many of the languages of the Native American peoples of the Pacific Northwest. The natural world is granted a spirituality or personality, the same language of the spiritual that people are granted. And so this indicates a respect among Native American peoples for their natural world. In contrast, we have antonym pairs in English, such as big and grow, meaning better generally, and small and shrink, meaning worse. And this is a way of expressing our lack of concern for making a smaller ecological footprint among many other things, and also indicating our drive for expansion, which is manifested in manifest destiny. However, the drive for our expansion is problematic, given that, as ecolinguist Aaron Stive estimates, a language needs approximately 300 years to adapt to become sustainable in a community. And obviously, English is expanding at a far more accelerated rate. And so, to make another biological parallel, it's become a type of invasive species, strangling out local languages. And this linguistic strangling is very much related to the biological, as evidenced by the correlation between both linguistic and biodiversity. According to the Cambridge Handbook of Endangered Languages, the most linguistic diverse regions of the world are also the most biodiverse, and inversely, the least linguistically diverse are the least biodiverse. And those regions being the least diverse would be Europe, followed by the Americas. And so, to conclude this slide, as such, a devaluation of linguistic diversity is also an attack upon the diversity of the environment the languages marginalized by dominating tongues inhabit. Alright, so far we've dealt with languages as they're known by linguistic sciences, as the generalities we know as Spanish, English, Quechua even. However, in practical application, we never experience language generally, but always experience it specifically, through the medium of the unique person or material form that speaks or embodies it. In this way, each instance of language is at once alike and different from the next. And given this, as noted by linguist Tove Spitner-Kengus and Robert Phillipson, the borders between languages and dialects and between one language and another are socio-political constructions. As such, the following three sections that I'm going to present are going to bring into dialogue the languages that linguistic science would term dialects and slangs through the perspectives of the people that speak them. And to preface this introduction, or this inclusion, I have a couple theories about language and culture. And this also acts as a way of showing that the ideas in European Western society resonate with ideas of those such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o of Kenyan society. The first theory that we're discussing by Edward Sapir, or commonly associated with Edward Sapir and his student Benjamin Worth, is the theory of linguistic relativity. And the strong version of this reads that language is something that determines our thoughts and behavior within culture, the weak version being that it influences our thoughts and behaviors. And this theory resonates with the second theory that I'm discussing, which is given by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, which is that language is the enabler of communication and carrier of culture. And these theories, so this theoretical knowledge, is evinced by the situation of African American Vernacular English, AAVE from now on, in modern American society. Linguist James McWhorter writes that AAVE reflects the contact with the myriad of non-standard dialects of English spoken by plantation owners, especially Scottish and Irish, of indentured servants, which with many black slaves would have come into contact. And in addition to this, the Creole Englishes from the Barbados and other West Indies colonies in which black slaves might have labored. However, in addition to James McWhorter's awareness of the Englishes that might have influenced AAVE, Geneva Smitherman also focuses on the influence of African culture, emphasizing the relationship between the authority of the spoken over the physical in African tradition with African American linguistic patterns in modern American society. And one of the examples she gives of this is rap, in which skillful rappers can avoid having to prove themselves through actions, through deeds, if their rap is strong enough. And so, moving away from culture now, if we acknowledge the importance of language to cultural heritage, then we also have to acknowledge the importance of multilingualism to cultural diversity. And with this thought, I'm going to transfer now to language and identity. Well, actually, we're not going to focus on subject. So on one level, language is important to identity in a general biological way. However, language is also important to the individual persons that comprise the human species. And we're not going to focus on this too much, especially because we just discussed the ethnocultural in previous slides, but the other types of identities that language impacts are the familial and the individual. Familial meaning that often one's first language is a language of affection, by which they can express their relationship to their families best. And on the individual level, we can take on different personalities in different languages. I remember reading one article in which a Chinese woman said that she felt more polite as a person in Chinese and more aggressive and dominant and able to take on that personality in English. So the language she spoke shifted who she was in a sense. Given the connections between language and personal identity, a monolingual mentality has not only the potential to negatively impact the aforementioned scientific, ecological, cultural, and personal spheres, but also to oppress the human beings that navigate them. Particularly among those whose tongues have been marginalized, language becomes a matter of human rights. And we see this in one sense in first and second language acquisition, in which a strong grasp of one's first language is directly correlated to one's understanding of a second language or a third language. And so in this way, language becomes a matter of access. Without a validation of someone's first language, the peoples of these marginalized tongues have less access to success in an English-speaking market. And through this lack of access, then, language also becomes a means of neocolonialism, or as Ngugi would term it, spiritual subjugation. And for those of you that need a brief paraphrase of neocolonialism, it's a form of indirect or covert oppression of a people's potential to thrive in society. And so, if language can be a form of oppression, then it can also be an impactor of people's legitimacy as human beings. And no one I've encountered is as much of a proponent of this argument as Chicana activist and author Gloria Anzaldúa, who writes, "Ethnic identity is twin to linguistic identity. I am my language. Until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. Until I can accept as legitimate Chicano, Texas, Spanish, Tex-Mex, and all the other languages I speak, I cannot accept the legitimacy of myself." And so as an example now of what Anzaldúa is communicating, we're now going to listen to a poem by Olga Angelina Garcia Echeverria called Lengualistic Algo, otherwise known as Speaking in Tongues.
Lengualistic algo, speaking in tongues. ¿Qué quieren conmigo los puristas? All tongue-tied and sitting proper behind fat, stoic dictionaries. I've already eaten the thin white skeletons of foreign words, choked on the bones of Ingles only, learned the art of speaking in codes and code switching, learned to spit palabras out of boca abierta like bullets, like fire, like fuego, like poems. Have already licked alive the crevices of open-legged borders bleeding the histories and languages of my name. Have already been witness to silence, to white-haired first-grade teacher bringing finger to lips and saying, "Shh, you're in America now. Speak English." Mi bisabuela fue yaqui, mi abuela mexicana, mi madre mestiza. Y yo, your worst linguistic nightmare hecho realidad. Aquí se le echa de todo. Islos, attitude, chile chipotle, Chicana power fist held in air. Aquí el inglés se quita sus moños, wears pantalones guangos and dances slow motion to oldies. Aquí el inglés trips over itself y el español comes down off its high imported Spanish horse, cruises down Whittier Boulevard in a cherry red Impala lowrider. Guachala, it rides the bus. Eats chile spice mangos and elote smothered in mayonesa. It learns to say pa instead of para, ca instead of acá, ya instead of allá. Travel, pa acá y pa allá, pa allá y pa acá, pa calor. Órale. Somos las chicas patas lenguas que no se rajan, cruzando fronteras sin papeles, illegal tongues jumping over barbed wire fences and running como las cucarachas when you hit the light switch. ¡Córrele, cuquita, córrele! Aquí el lenguaje existe en el momento que Conejo hits up Pablo for a ride con "Come on, vato, give me un aventón to la marqueta." Y Pablo lo manda a la fregada with the wave of a hand y con Chale tú, ¿qué me ves? Cara de taxi cab. Aquí se usa lo que sirve, el rascuache, el mestizaje, las leftovers y lo yet to be born. Aquí cada palabra está viva, respira. And all the chicas patas, las guachalas, los eses and esas of the world stand up in defiance and shout, hey, and ain't I a word?
Okay, so I would love to show the rest of the poem later to any of you that are interested, but we're going to pause it there and return to our presentation. So, getting back to what we're trying to communicate here, from the perspectives of the marginalized, such as Elena, as well as Anzaldúa and Bubi and all these peoples, and the relationships that we've seen between language and science, biodiversity, culture, identity, and human rights, one understands how a monolingual ideology could negatively impact human equality, identity, and understanding, as well as our interactions with each other and the world in which we inhabit. And this understanding then moves us toward realizing the necessity of a multilingual society. However, in order to do this, we need a new mythology upon which we can found our language. And first, to return to kind of recapitulate our old mythology. In the myth of Philomela, in slicing the abused princess's tongue from her mouth, Tereus initiates this sort of sharp discord and violence that reverberates throughout the human and natural world. Not only do his actions result in agony for the mutilated Philomela and her family, but the violence he inflicts upon the princess instigates her and her sister Procne to respond in turn, tearing his innocent infant son limb from limb and feeding him to the unwitting Tereus. Ultimately, consumed by anguish and ire, Tereus gives chase to the revenged sisters, during which all three turn to birds. Tereus's linguistic tyranny spills from the human into the natural world. Though in a subtler and often more indirect manner, the situation of Standard English and the marginalized languages over which it rules mirror that of its mythological predecessors. In a multifaceted world, a monolingual ideology not only limits the capacities of language, but also the understanding of our ecology, our culture, and ourselves. And this alienation of language then enables a subjugation of those whose languages, dominant tongues, push to the fringe of society. And thus, one final question remains. What is the place of Standard English in a diverse world? How can we deconstruct the story of Standard English such that a new multilingual appreciation may rise out of its binding? Now we need a little reminder from Marx. This isn't to say we need to get rid of English, especially given that since the language's due to English's economic dominance, it stands very little chance of disappearing anytime soon. And further, it is the language of agency. And in addition to this, to argue for the diversity of language and also argue against the existence of one of the most prominently spoken is utterly paradoxical. Just as there is a value to each and every language with which Standard English comes into contact, there is a value contained within Standard English itself. English is ever adapting and shifting to new situations that its speakers encounter. And so how can this vast and voracious language adapt to respect and privilege the other languages of the world? The answer, I think, at least in part, resides with the marginalized voices that have adapted it. And the one that I'm going to discuss today is Nigerian author Chinua Achebe. So Chinua Achebe maintains the value of English and other world languages for African literature. According to Achebe, African literature is not one unit, but a group of associated units, the sum total of all the national and ethnic literatures of Africa. Under this model, literatures written in the languages indigenous to any particular region and English both have merit. The reason Achebe grants national merit to texts written in English stem from the fact that English facilitates mutual communication between the many diverse perspectives of the African continent so that all of its members might be able to thrive. Achebe recognizes the destructive colonial ideology and history attached to the English Empire and its language. However, he also recognizes though one may glean some sort of unintended good from the empire's remnants. Despite the atrocities of those who brought English to the African continent, Achebe argues that English has united the African peoples through giving them a tongue in which to engage each other. This unity enables the African people to form a further unity around their cause. He writes, if English failed to give them a song, it at least gave them a tongue for sighing. However, Achebe's validation of English doesn't imply his disrespect for the many other languages of the African continent. Rather than sterility, Achebe associates English with a new voice coming out of Africa, speaking of African experiences in a worldwide language. The new voice to which Achebe refers balances his or one's use of the English language with a meticulous attention to the region and peoples it represents. The African writer should aim to use English in a way that brings out his message best without altering the language so much that its value as a medium of international exchange is lost. He should aim at fashioning an English that is at once universal and able to carry his particular experience. When one writes in English, he or she should not write with the intention of replacing the native or ethnic languages of the regions he or she represents. Instead, one should strive to bring a new English into full communion with its ancestral home, but altered to suit its new surroundings, such that national and ethnic identities might prosper. So, the symbiotic relationship that Achebe encourages between standard English and the marginalized languages it affects may be the most feasible and desirable means of combating the imperialistic globalization of monolingualism and the tyranny of a modern Terrius. Following Achebe's lead, we learn to approach the mythology of violent dominance, the rape of Philomela details, and to deconstruct it until it becomes a new and just form. Only when we treat standard English as malleable and meant to stand alongside rather than atop the many languages with which it comes into contact will our world learn to treasure and understand the variegated perspectives of its people, the scientific, biological, cultural, and personal, so that we all might truly flourish in the society in which we live.